Pearl Harbor secured for the Japanese the initiative in the Pacific. They chose first to strike southward. By March 1942, the Netherlands East Indies, and with them any opportunity of reinforcing the Philippines, had largely disappeared in the maw of Nippon's war machine. March and April, a successful but less precipitate foe devoted to the initial digestion of his gains and the extension of his forces along the flanks of Australia. Already, Australian security had thus become the first charge of United States forces in the South Pacific, and defence of Australia meant defence of the last remaining reinforcement route to the subcontinent, the 7,000 miles of island-studded Pacific seas lying between San Francisco and Sydney. Twice more the enemy moved offensively. A thrust in early May against either Port Moresby or the Free French Isle of New Caledonia, bastion of the supply route from the United States, was smashed in the Coral Sea, and after 6th June, with its ambitious two-pronged offensive against Midway and the Aleutians crushed at Midway, the Japanese fleet retired westward to lick its wounds. For the first time in the Pacific War, America possessed the initiative, a limited, precarious initiative, demanding the earliest possible exploitation. How this initiative was employed is the history of the operation against Guadalcanal and Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. Primarily, it was an operation to safeguard Australia's supply line, threatened first from Rabaul, secured by the enemy in January, then from Tulagi, where by May the Japanese were already well established. It was at Tulagi on Florida Island that the Yorktown's aircraft carried out a successful strike during the Battle of the Coral Sea. In June, grass was burning on Guadalcanal's Lunga Plain, one of the few spots in the Solomons where an airdrome could easily be built. Around 4 July, Japanese troops and construction personnel moved ashore, and in less than a month, Allied search planes saw the first signs of what appeared to be a concrete runway. The Tulagi-Lunga Plain combination was extremely convenient. Enclosed by the small islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the harbour at Tulagi is deep and spacious. With air cover from Guadalcanal, it presents an excellent naval base site. Backing this advanced base were Rabaul, only 565 nautical miles distant, Bougainville, with the important Buenfaisi-Tonolé complex, protected from Kahili Field, at its southern tip, Quieta, where an airdrome was already being laid out, an impressive array of supporting bases, and from many lesser bases in the Solomons, from Gizo, Rakata Bay, Quieta and Buka, passage seaplanes were already operating. With Lunga airdrome complete, land-based bombers would be able to soften the New Hebrides for a thrust southward. If the Japanese were to be stopped short of a point where they could snap the lifeline to Australia, then Tulagi-Guadalcanal offered the last possible opportunity. The man facing this problem was Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, Commander South Pacific Area. As Commander, South Pacific Area, Admiral Gormley commanded all United States ground, air and naval forces in his area, and certain New Zealand units as well. His air commander was Rear Admiral John S. McCain, who as Commander, Air, South Pacific Force, controlled all land-based aircraft in the South Pacific area, including those of the United States Army Air Forces. Top Army commander in the South Pacific was Major General Millard F. Harmon, who arrived in the theater to assume the title of Commanding General, United States Army Forces in the South Pacific area, only a week before the Guadalcanal offensive opened. Subordinate to Commander, South Pacific Area, General Harmon was charged with the training and administration of all United States Army ground and Air Force troops in the South Pacific. His advent clarified the supply and administration of the string of island bases and lessened any possibility of Army units disintegrating organically under local Navy, Marine, or New Zealand control. General Harmon had stepped directly from the post of Chief of the Air Staff. Moreover, the small staff which flew down with him to Noumea in the last week of July numbered such officers as Brigadier General Nathan F. Twining, future commander of the 13th and 15th Air Forces, Lieutenant Colonel Dean C. Erie Owes, Strother, future commander of the 13th Fighters, and Colonel Frank Everest, who was to command its bombers. If Admiral McCain retained operational control of Air Corps units, he recognized that the wide dispersion and dissimilar composition of his air establishment made it impracticable to exercise his command directly. Training and a certain amount of tactical discretion remained to Commanding General, United States Army Forces and his subordinate commanders. In July, the Army Air Forces were mainly represented in the forward area by the 11th Bombardment Group Heavy and the 67th Fighter Squadron. The former disposed of 27 B-17s on New Caledonia and 8 at Nandi in the Fijis. The 67th mustered 38 P-39s and P-400s, all on New Caledonia. The P-400, to quote the men who flew it, was a cheap version of the early P-39s. Additionally, there were on New Caledonia 10 B-26s with a dozen more in the Fijis. Despite the fact that a workable basis for Army-Navy cooperation had been reached at a time when the June victory at Midway made it possible to mount an initial offensive against the Japanese, the remainder of 1,942 loomed precariously for the Allies in the South Pacific. The Midway battle had only approximately restored the balance of fleet power. Shipping was extremely short. Only the 1st Marine Division, reinforced, could be spared for the attack on Guadalcanal. General Harmon found himself in command of units originally sent post-haste in early 1942 to garrison the stepping stones to Australia, units largely tied down to a defence for which they were scarcely adequate. Nevertheless, preparations for the blow against the Guadalcanal area went forward. As early as April, Tulagi had been designated the #1 American objective in the Solomons. The Marines began arriving in New Zealand in mid-June. Day was set originally for 1st August, then for as near that date as practicable. Arrangements were completed whereby General MacArthur's aircraft would search and bomb in the northern Solomons and strike the airdromes at Lae and Salamaua. The final week in July saw the initial B-17s of the 11th Bombardment Group arrive in the South Pacific, the 1st Squadron landing during a driving rainstorm at Plains de Gaillac Airdrome on New Caledonia. The 11th had been based in Hawaii, was a veteran of Midway. Now, under the leadership of Colonel Laverne G. Saunders, it was to participate in the attack on Guadalcanal. The Army Air Forces, seeking to give air striking forces a mobility analogous to that of major naval units, had initially distrusted committing heavy bombers to fixed assignments in the islands. The area was described as linear in type and of limited depth. Its defence, it was thought, could be accomplished more economically by holding major air-striking forces at the extremities and providing bases and logistical services for their rapid concentration against a threat to intermediate points. Originally, this concept envisaged stationing heavy bombers only in Hawaii and Australia. However, in July, the 11th Group was ordered to New Caledonia as the Mobile Force, Central Pacific, and below in Australia the 19th Group was named the Mobile Force in the Southwest Pacific. 4 days after the new designation, the squadrons of the 11th Group left Hickam Field, the 98th and 42nd arriving at Plains de Gaillac on the 21st and 23rd of July, respectively. On the 24th, the 431st landed at Nandi in the Fijis, and the following day the pilots of the 26th set down their planes at Efate. It had been planned to base 1 squadron each at Plains de Gaillac, Kumak, also on New Caledonia Nandi, and Efate, and advance these when practicable to the new base under construction at Espiritu Santo. Lying directly in the path of a possible thrust from the Solomons, Espiritu had been a sort of no-man's land. Admiral McCain, perceiving the value of the position to the contemplated seizure of Tulagi, had immediately upon his arrival in the theatre in May requested that troops be sent in and an airfield constructed. The troops were sent, but construction of the airdrome was not approved. Nevertheless, Commander, Air, South Pacific Force surveyed a site, built a road to it, and confidently awaited orders to complete the project. The orders came in July. All available troops pitched in, and in 16 days an airstrip 5 to 1,000 by 2 to 100 feet was hacked out. On 30th July, Major Alan J. Blank, Seward of the 11th Group's 26th Squadron, set down the first B-17 on the new strip. For the Guadalcanal operation, Admiral McCain divided his shore-based planes into task groups. The 11th constituted the second task group, responsible for daily search of the southern Solomons and their western waters, for tracking important enemy contacts, and for execution of air attacks as directed. The dual role of search and bombing assigned the B-17s by Commander, Air, South Pacific Forces operations orders had been foreshadowed by his policy of placing the B-17s, together with the Navy patrol bombers, under both air patrol and bomber commands at South Pacific air bases, the great areas of the Pacific, shielding a powerful and aggressive enemy fleet, made search a prime necessity. With its service crew still at sea, the 11th nevertheless tackled vital photo work almost on arrival, flying photographic missions over the Tulagi-Guadalcanal Gavutu area on 23rd and 25th July and getting its first taste of local fighter opposition when Float Zeros ineffectively intercepted both missions. During the very few days remaining before the departure of the Marines for Guadalcanal, strenuous efforts were made to procure information on Japanese positions. Major General Alexander A. Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marines, was experiencing a woeful lack of photos, and Navy charts were badly out of date. In an effort to remedy this situation, the 435th Squadron of the 19th Group during June and July had flown a number of reconnaissance missions over the Guadalcanal-Tulagi area from Port Moresby. General Vandergrift particularly desired recent photographs of the north coast of Guadalcanal, the area he was called on to attack. He received only two, a print of Tulagi and one of the Lunga, Point Kukum area, both dropped on a carrier by light planes, developed and forwarded to the Marine Commander by Commander, Air, South Pacific Force, and constituting the first photos to reach General Vandergrift since 24th June. At no time during 1942 were trained Army personnel or Army photographic equipment available for photographic work. Cameras came from the Navy. Photographers from the Marines. Only the 11th B-17s represented the Army, and this condition remained standard operating procedure until Army Air Force's photo and mapping units arrived in 1943. Quackenbush's Gypsies, as Lieutenant Commander Robert Quackenbush's naval photo personnel were named, regularly flew with the heavies on photographic coverage of the Solomons. Colonel Saunders' bombardment directive from Admiral McCain was both general and concise: to hit Tulagi and Guadalcanal with maximum strength from 31st July to 6th August, inclusive. Commander, Air, South Pacific Force, left the group commander free to carry out this task as he saw fit, and the 11th forthwith inaugurated heavy bombardment against the Japanese in the South Pacific. During the 7 days, in addition to 22 sorties for purposes of search, the group flew 56 bombardment sorties, a most creditable performance in view of the primitive conditions under which operations laboured. Although the advanced field on Espiritu Santo was reported ready, Colonel Saunders was sceptical as to its service facilities and decided to open his attack from F8, 710 nautical miles from the target at Guadalcanal. For his first mission on 31st July, Colonel Saunders mustered every plane possessing a radio compartment tank. Since each of the 9 aircraft thus equipped also carried a bomb bay tank, full bomb loads were impossible. But in spite of this considerable reduction in striking power, the initial blow was a success. Led by Colonel Saunders, the forts flew the 710 miles to Guadalcanal under the protection of bad weather and unloaded their bombs from 14,000 feet. The first flight, carrying 500-pounders, struck at the new landing strip, while the remaining 6 aircraft ravaged the supply dumps in the Lunga Point area with 100-pounders. Resistance was slight, the anti-aircraft artillery ineffective, and the Zeros at Gavutu, probably without functioning radar, failed to leave the water in time for interception. The bombers came through Mission 1 against Guadalcanal, undamaged. It was determined that Lunga Point held the chief concentrations of supply and personnel, and first claimed to Colonel Saunders' attention. Next ranked the nearly complete Lunga Airdrome, shortly to become Henderson Field. Tulagi also was to receive a quota of bombs almost daily. Thus was the pattern set. On 1st August, the B-17s bagged 2 Zeros. On the next day they got 1, and started fires in the Lunga and Tulagi storage areas. By the 3rd, reports had come in of land-based Zeros on the Lunga field, and on 4 August 5 enemy fighters intercepted a 3-plane flight over the target. In this engagement, a float, Zero, flaming and pressing a close attack, struck a B-17 near the No. 3 engine, causing an explosion which destroyed plane and crew. This, the first destruction of one of our aircraft by ramming, was considered the result of a zero out of control rather than intentional self-sacrifice. With the field on Espiritu operational by 1st August, B-17s headed for Guadalcanal were able to take on full bomb loads, fill their radio tanks at Efate, and refuel at Espiritu on the return leg. Tulagi and the Cucum area of Guadalcanal were thus bombed on 5th August, when another B-17 was lost. And on day, 7th August, 2 search planes dispatched to cover the Solomons sector to a depth of 700 miles from Espiritu. By that time the main base took off at 3 a.m. with instructions to avoid the target area where the attack was scheduled at 5:30 a.m. One aircraft failed to return. Below the searching B-17s, the Battle of Guadalcanal was unfolding. 2 major task forces had been set up for the occasion. Rear Admiral Lee Noyes commanded the supporting carriers, Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, the amphibious force which would undertake the attack. Overall command of these groups was vested in Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher on the Saratoga. On 31st July, the amphibious force had left Coro Island in the Fijis, where it had proceeded from New Zealand to hold landing rehearsals. As the fleet cleared the New Hebrides, the weather changed to a complete overcast, effectively hiding the force from enemy search planes. Navy PBYs, meanwhile, operating from Endony in the Santa Cruz group towards enemy bases to the north, reported no hostile concentrations. At 1:33 a.m., 7th August, the dim bulk of Guadalcanal could be made out, and the attack forces slid past Savo Island, the one to the north headed for Tulagi, the southern standing in for the Lunga area. The surprise was complete. At 6:13 a.m., the cruiser Quincy opened on targets near Cucum on Guadalcanal, and 2 minutes later carrier planes, appearing on schedule, joined the attack. Simultaneously, the bombardment of Tulagi commenced. The landing at Guadalcanal occurred without opposition. Carrier-based aircraft from the Enterprise and the Saratoga shielded the operation. Instead of the 5,000 enemy estimated on the island, a mere 600 Japanese were reported by prisoners, and these promptly took to the hills. The Marines met relatively light opposition on Guadalcanal during the first day, but at Gavutu and Tulagi, across Sea Lark Channel, resistance was fierce, and these islands were not mopped up for several days. On the 8th, the Marines occupied Lunga Airdrome. The runway, damaged from 11th Group attacks, was rapidly reparable, and in addition to this important field, large semi-permanent camps, finger wharves, machine shops, radio sets, and an ice and power plant fell to the Marines. These gains, however, were not to be consolidated in peace. The Japanese reacted promptly with air and naval forces, and on the afternoon of day hurled 2 heavy air attacks at the transports lying off Guadalcanal. The evening of the 8th, Admiral Fletcher requested permission to withdraw his carriers. Combat with raiding enemy aircraft and other causes had reduced his carrier strength from 99 to 78 fighters. Fuel was running low, and the presence of large numbers of enemy bombers in the area presented a serious menace. Admiral Gormley agreed to the request late that night, and towards morning the air support force began retirement to the south. Its withdrawal left the amphibious force dangerously exposed to enemy air, and the decision was consequently taken to withdraw the remainder of the invasion fleet at 6 a.m. the following day. Previously, it had been planned that the transports would unload until D+4. On the 8th, the Japanese Navy took a hand. Through the moonless, Solomon's night, a Japanese task force, slipping down past Savo Island, closed with the Allied cruisers protecting the transports off Guadalcanal. Searchlights and flares illumined the sea. Then the sudden shock of shell and torpedo, and when the Japanese fleet retired into the night, it had sunk 4 heavy cruisers and 1 destroyer, the core of the forces patrolling off Savo Island. The beachhead was uncovered. The Marines were left to shift for themselves, and on 9 August the transports up, anchored for the safety of Noumea. For a time, the 11th settled back into its search routine. On days immediately following the landings, the bombers covered the lower Solomons on sectors ranging from 286 degrees over to 316 degrees from Espiritu to a depth of 700 to 800 miles. Ordinarily, contact was with friendly surface forces. However, on 9th August, 2 light cruisers, 2 destroyers, and a number of seaplane tenders were reported heading for Recatta Bay on Santa Isabel. 8 B-17s were bombed up and took off, but, despite ideal visibility, failed to sight the enemy. Daily searches through 14th August failed to reveal anything significant, only a handful of landing barges on Florida Island. By the 15th, the Japanese were more in evidence. Destroyers, cargo vessels, even light cruisers began to frequent the Central Solomons, and Gizo Island and Gizo Bay in the New Georgia group became favorite target areas for the 11th. Moreover, the tedium of the long searches was apt to be broken by engagements with the huge Japanese patrol aircraft, the 4-engine Kawanishi 97s, or their only slightly smaller successors. These Goliaths were slower and less maneuverable than the B-17s. Their 20mm cannon were outranged by the .50 calibers. Invariably, Colonel Saunders' pilots attempted to close with them. The first victim fell to the crew of Captain W.Y. Lucas when, after a 25-minute combat, the Kawanishi, attempting to settle her damaged bulk on the sea, was blown up by the fort's tail gunner. By 30th September, the 11th had encountered 21 Kawanishi. 5 were destroyed and 7 damaged. Meantime, the enemy prepared his counterblow. On 12th August, Admiral Gormley had reported naval concentrations at Rabaul and in the Bougainville region. A week later, these concentrations began to appear in the Buin-Faizi area, and on the 20th, the Admiral warned Colonel Saunders that the task forces to retake Guadalcanal already were moving down from Truk and Ponape. The grinding routine of sea search became of utmost importance. Day after day, the forts, taking off from Espiritu at 3 a.m., crossing over Tulagi at sunrise and, scouring the sea to the northwest, logged 1,600 miles of open water flying. Daily action had taken its toll. From 31st July to 20th August, 11 B-17s were lost, 8 operationally, 2 at sea, only 1 in combat. Men and equipment stood up well against the enemy. Japanese gunnery, both aerial and anti-aircraft artillery, was uniformly poor, and the supposedly fanatical enemy pilots showed little eagerness to close with the B-17s. During the 8 days of intensive operations preceding the landings, enemy fighters were engaged on all but 2 missions to the Guadalcanal-Tulagi area, and other than in the ramming incident, no fort was lost to the float planes. The few hits scored on the heavies were by 7.7mm fire and not very damaging. 3 crew members were slightly wounded. The pilots learned that the Japanese always attacked singly, that, if the forts turned their formation into him, he would always draw off at the fire of the turret guns. Bad weather, not the Zero, was the chief antagonist. Lack of homing facilities and radio direction-finding equipment brought down more B-17s than enemy pilots did. In the Pacific, theaters, nature, and distance are usually as formidable a foe as the Japanese. When Colonel Saunders and his 98th Squadron set their ships down on Plains de Gaillac on 21st July, they found a red dust strip hacked out of a swamp. High in iron oxide, this dust, sifting through the filters, honed out the cylinders, so that shortly the B-17s were fortunate to fly 6 hours with a full load of oil. Additional complications were lack of service and maintenance personnel. 9 maintenance men for 9 aircraft were all that could accompany the 26th to a fate, and these 9 served additionally as ground crew during the subsequent 3-week period of intensive operations. Under such circumstances, a large share of the service and maintenance burden fell upon the combat crew. The 26th owed a debt of gratitude to the Negro enlisted men of the 24th Infantry Regiment, who helped to service the planes and even improvised spare parts. Artillerymen messed the airmen on Effete, while over on Espiritu the entire 98th Squadron, not excepting Colonel Saunders, slept under trees or wings, or in the forts themselves. The 11th had no water carts. 2 of its 8 Cletraks had arrived at Nandi when they were needed at Espiritu. The shops aboard the United States ship Curtis, Admiral McCain's headquarters, contributed tow bars, but homing devices and navigational aids could not be improvised. At Espiritu existed a fair example of South Pacific logistics. On 18th of August, Colonel Saunders described its unloading facilities as one barge, a sandy beach and a prayer. Heavy equipment was slung over the side of cargo vessels into a lighter. Ashore there were no cranes, and the small finger piers made of coconut, logs salted down with coral washed out and disappeared after 2 or 3 weeks' use. Since the supply officer seldom was informed of arrival dates, boxes and crates accumulated in the coconut groves. There was no question of living off the country. Each item of food, clothing and housing had to be brought in. The mud was there in abundance. Espiritu possessed a foot-thick covering of soft black dirt, a quagmire after the tropical rains. The Navy had moved .50 caliber ammunition and 300,000 gallons of gasoline to Espiritu in preparation for the 11th. Fuel consumption had been estimated for 2 weeks of operations and a safety factor of 100% allowed, but the supply was exhausted in 10 days, and only the timely arrival of the nearer Luckenbach with 3,000 drums of gasoline prevented operations from coming to a sudden halt. Getting the fuel out of the drums and into the tanks of the B-17s was one of those impossible jobs which somehow got done. Gas trucks and trailers did not exist. The steel drums were dumped over the ship's side, floated ashore in nets, hand-rolled up under the trees, and dispersed in dumps of 20 to 30. From these they were loaded on trucks, rolled up on stands, and emptied into the tank wagons which serviced the aircraft. On 6th August, all available hands included Colonel Saunders and Brigadier General William C. Rose, who commanded ground forces on Espiritu and Efeiti, worked a bucket line for 20 hours in a driving storm to put 25,000 gallons of gasoline aboard the bombers. But such labours were not enough, and strike missions were delayed for lack of service facilities. Espiritu's airdrome was no Randolph Field, a narrow strip cut partly from a coconut grove, partly from the encroaching jungle, revetments barely deep enough to keep a B-17's nose off the runway, and so narrow a man had to stand at each wingtip to guide the pilots. Out to the short taxiway. No lights. Bottles of oil with paper wicks flickered along the runway, and jeep headlights marked its end as the early morning missions took off. The squadrons of the 11th were distributed as follows: the 42nd at Plains de Gaillac, the 98th at Espiritu, where the 26th subsequently joined from Efate, and the 431st at Nandi. Headquarters was at Efate, but Colonel Saunders maintained a command post on Espiritu and flew part of his headquarters personnel there on 10th August. Nandi, the most rearward of the bases, was clean and quiet and served as a rest area and a convenient place for engine changes. Colonel Saunders regularly relieved his units after 1 week in the forward area. Operational control defied the field manuals. The wide dispersal of the units and unreliable radio communications made contact with the squadrons exceedingly difficult. Colonel Saunders could exercise direct control only over the Parato, 14 fortresses at Espiritu, and even this was complicated by lack of field telephones and motor transport. He was running 4 search missions daily and holding 6 aircraft for a striking force. In an emergency, he might supplement the latter with 6 B-17s from Efate, but he strongly doubted that the Efate contingent could hit the target at such a distance. He advised General Harmon that additional fields were needed on Espiritu. By the 18th of August, the supply situation of the group had become critical. 6 ball turret doors had already broken off and no spares were available. Turbo supercharger regulators were giving trouble, as were flight and engine instruments. The dusty fields necessitated constant engine changes. Nandi's 12 spares were already in service, and the next change at Plains de Gaillac would exhaust the supply in New Caledonia. But in spite of such operational aches and twinges, the 11th was prepared to take part in the series of actions known as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the first Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal. Following the disastrous Savo Island drama, there had been a lull on Guadalcanal. The Navy ran in small reinforcement convoys, but operated its task forces well to the southward of the island, out of range of Japanese search planes, and the enemy seized the opportunity to reinforce Guadalcanal on his own account. Nightly, His destroyers and cruisers shelled the Marines, for the most part without let or hindrance. The beginnings of the Tokyo Express were discernible. However, on 19th of August, a light cruiser venturing on such a reinforcement mission was unwisely left exposed in Sealark Channel by day. A searching fort spotted her, banked for a bombing run. The delighted Marines saw columns of dark brown smoke pour from abaft the warship's mainmast. She made for the open sea beyond Savo, her fantail afire, and later sank. On the 23rd, the Navy received warning that the Japanese were moving on the Solomons from the north. Carrier task forces, including the Saratoga, the Enterprise, and the new North Carolina, were readied to meet the threat. On the 24th, the Saratoga's torpedo and dive bombers, engaging the Japanese carrier Ryujo, sent her into an evasive turn, dived in a coordinated attack, and hammered their bombs the length of her deck. Fierce air battles during the day all but stripped the enemy carriers of their aircraft, and by nightfall the enemy fleet, badly hurt, retired. The damaged Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor for repair. In relation to its striking power, the 11th Group played an important role in this action. On 24th August at 12:15 p.m., Colonel Saunders was advised of a contact with an enemy carrier force 720 miles from Espiritu. Admiral McCain, aware that a B-17 strike would involve hazardous night landings, left the attack decision to Colonel Saunders. The risk was accepted. 2 flights of heavies were dispatched separately, 3 forts under Major Ernest R. Manier, and 4 led by Major Sowat. At 5:45 p.m., the 3-plane flight attacked a carrier, dead in the water and under tow by a cruiser or large destroyer. On the first run, the bombs overshot, and the forts banked for another try. 4 direct hits were claimed. Whether this vessel was the Ryujo, blasted more than an hour before by the Saratoga's planes, or another small carrier is unknown. When this flight returned to Espiritu, the night landing took its toll. Espiritu's field was just a wide slash through the jungle, with low hills close in. As the planes approached, a tropical rainstorm drenched the field, and the darkness was complete. Lieutenant Robert E. Genther's plane, the number 4 engine failing, went into a steep bank and crashed into the hillside. The pilot and 4 of the crew were lost. 60 miles to the eastward of Major Manier's strike, Major Seward's 4 B-17s surprised a second Japanese armada at twilight. Below the forts ploughed a possible small carrier with escort of 1 battleship, 4 light cruisers, and 4 destroyers. The forts steadied for the run. 2 or more hits were claimed on the carrier, but final results were observed only by 1 ball turret gunner, who contended that the warship could not have been a carrier since the 500-pounders had knocked her turrets off. The attack did not go, unopposed, and of a swarm of Zeros attacking the bombers 5 were surely 7 probably destroyed. 2 of the forts were damaged and all were desperately low on fuel, but Major Seward led his flight back to Efate intact. Again, on the 25th, the heavies saw action. The preceding day, Lunga Airdrome, now named Henderson Field after the commander of the Marine dive bombers at Midway, had been attacked by land and carrier-based planes, the latter probably from the Ryujo. Newly arrived Marine pilots, defending the Guadalcanal lodgment, knocked down 21 of the attackers for a loss of 3. At midnight, the Marine positions were shelled by 4 enemy warships, one of which may have been sunk by dive bombers from Henderson. A dawn air attack was anticipated, but none came. At 8:35 a.m. on the 25th, 8 escorted dive bombers from Guadalcanal uncovered the main Japanese occupation force about 125 miles to the north. 1 large and 3 small transports, escorted by a heavy cruiser, light cruisers, and 4 destroyers, presented a fat target. 1,000-pounders gutted the large transport and damaged the heavy cruiser. 8 additional B-17s, leaving distant Espiritu at 6:17 a.m., broke the back of either a cruiser or a destroyer with 3 direct hits from 500-pounders, and at 10:15 a.m. saw her sink. By noon of the 25th, the Japanese were making all speed to the north, and Guadalcanal was, for the moment, secure. From this telling action, the 11th returned to the tedium of search duties and primitive operational conditions. The enemy reverted to a pattern of harassing attacks and minor reinforcement efforts. At noon on the 25th, 21 Japanese bombers pounded Henderson Field, and that evening destroyers landed reinforcements at Cape Esperance and came down Sealark Channel, guns ablaze. By this time, however, Guadalcanal had the means to defend itself, partially at least, against such measures. Marine fighters and dive bombers were based on the island, and elements of the United States Army Air Force's 67th Fighter Squadron had arrived. Except for lone, cruising B-17s, the Marines saw few friendly aircraft for almost a fortnight after the withdrawal of the Navy carriers on the night of 8th August. Meanwhile, back-breaking labour was completing the unfinished Japanese airstrip, and on the afternoon of the 20th, the stubby little carrier, Long Island, from some 200 miles southeast of Guadalcanal, catapulted 2 Marine squadrons, VMF 223 with 19 F-4F-4's Grumman Wildcat fighters under Major John L. Smith, and VMSB 232 with 12 SBD-3's Douglas Dauntless dive bombers under Lieutenant Colonel Richard C. Mangrum. These were followed in 2 days by 5 long-nosed Army fighters, P-400s of the 67th Fighter Squadron, under Captain Dale Brannan. The P-400s, which flew into Henderson on 22nd August, inaugurated a route over which many an Army fighter was destined to pass before the Japanese were driven from the Lower Solomons. In none too short hops they had flown all the way from New Caledonia, employing the Atlantic technique, fighters, equipped with belly tanks, shepherded by bombers or transports. Leaving Blaines de Gaillac on 21st August, Captain Brannan's flight of 5 hopped 325 miles to Efate, 180 more, to Espiritu. The following day, with gas tanks topped off after the warm-up, the P-400s tackled the 640 miles to Henderson. Gas consumption had been predicated upon low engine speed, a lean mixture, a 15-mile tailwind, and, in Captain Brannan's opinion, a landing powered by the proverbial fumes. Imperfect navigation and enemy fighters were written off. The P-400s flew on the deck, at 200 feet, through mist and low-hanging clouds. In clear spaces they spread out. When weather loomed ahead, they snuggled under the navigating B-17's wing. A second fort followed with rubber boats, to be tossed to the pilots if they bailed out. After 3 hours and 45 minutes of flying, all 5 planes were set down on the Lunga airstrip. The following day, Lieutenant Robert E. Chilson, with 30 enlisted men of the 67th Ground Echelon, arrived off Lunga in the transport Fomalhaut, and when Captain John A. Thompson brought in 9 more P-400s on 27th August, the 67th was ready for action. If hardships prepare men for hardships, the 67th was prepared for Guadalcanal. Its personnel had sailed from New York in January 1,942 inches, a crowded transport with inadequate water tanks. The men had received a daily ration of 1 canteen for washing, drinking and shaving. After 38 days at sea, they were rested for a week at a camp near Melbourne, Australia, and on 15th March disembarked on New Caledonia, where the inhabitants, military and civilian, momentarily expected the Japanese. The 67th's airplanes were not only in crates, but of a type only 2 of its pilots had ever flown. The 67th's new home was a half-completed airfield up at Tontuta, 35 miles from Noumea. Its one combination truck and trailer took one of the crated planes to Tontuta every 8 hours, alternately groaning and highballing over the mountainous road. When the crates were pried open, instructions for P-39Ds, Fs and Ks were found, but none for P-400s. Neither were the mechanics familiar with the plane. Still, the work of assembly went forward. The men slept under shelter halves, the officers in a farmhouse, 44 of them in parlour, bedroom and earth-floored basement, all united in cursing the sudden, unpredictable rains and in fighting the mosquitoes. Tools for assembly consisted of 10 kits of simple first-echelon maintenance tools. Lines were found plugged with Scotch tape. 1 P-400's electrical circuit had evidently had the attention of a factory maniac. When the flap switch was pressed, wheels would retract. When the wheel switch was pressed, the guns would fire. Nevertheless, In less than a month, 41 planes were assembled with the aid of the 65th Material Squadron, and the pilots were checked out with only a single accident. The squadron, finding that the P-400's instruments were inferior, learned how to fly without them. Spare parts all came from salvage, and one plane, the Resurrection, eventually evolved as 100% Mutt. When Captain Brannan and his pilots landed at Henderson, action was not long in coming. The Marine pilots had pointed out on a little knoll near the runway the Japanese pagoda which served as Allied Air Operations headquarters. Near it was a flagpole up which a black flag was run when an air raid threatened. There was no real warning system. The first radar did not function until September, but from other sources reports of approaching enemy formations were received. On the hot, sunny afternoon of the 24th, pilots and ground crew were working around the P-400s when the black flag was hoisted. Already the drone of engines could be heard. Two of the 67th's pilots made a run for their planes, Captain Brannan and Lieutenant D.H. Fincher taking off with the Grummans in a cloud of dust. 30 seconds later, the bombs hit. The P-400s staggered off over the palm trees and evaded the Zeros sweeping down to strafe. The Grummans climbed to 8,000 feet, knocked down all but one of the 9 enemy bombers, which may have come from the doomed Ryujo off to the north. The Army pilots happened on a wandering Zero, pumped lead until it exploded. The Marines, living largely on the Japanese quartermaster, introduced the pilots to life on Guadalcanal. In the green, canopied marine tents were straw sleeping mats and enamelware eating bowls, both Japanese. Also Japanese were the chow, largely fish and rice, the cigarettes, and even the caramels. Socks, always too short, and loincloths were also available by courtesy of the Japanese QM. And across the river, a bare 200 yards away, was the enemy, with his snipers always alert for United States officers' insignia. Until the arrival of VMF 223 and VMSB 232, the Tulagi-Guadalcanal area had been without air resources. Moreover, few supplies had come through to the beachhead. General Vandergrift had thrown a perimeter defense around the airfield upon its capture, and was able to set up 1 battery of 90mm guns and 58 automatic weapon positions against enemy air raids. The F-4F-4s were immediately assigned. The air defense of the area and the SBDs began to conduct long single-plane searches over enemy positions at Guadalcanal and northward up to New Georgia and Santa Isabel. Operating under Marine Command, the P-400s soon took up part of the burden. On the 25th, they were up on dawn to dusk patrols over Henderson, and on the 26th, 2 pilots flew reconnaissance around the entire Guadalcanal coastline. By the last week in August, Japanese tactics in the Solomons had begun to take form. In the Buenfaizi area of Bougainville, at Vella La Vella on Kula Gulf, and at Ricata Bay on Santa Isabel, the Japanese had bases easily supplied from Truk and Rabaul. By September, enemy men and supplies were being loaded on fast vessels, destroyers or cruisers. These marauders, hiding from the Henderson-based aircraft during daylight, by night came fast down the slot between the parallel lines of islands, landed men and supplies, stood off Henderson Field, shelled it, and were generally safe in the central Solomons by daylight. Thus, the enemy in the Guadalcanal bush would be reinforced to the point of mounting a final attack on the beachhead, at which time other Japanese, supported by a sizable portion of the Imperial Navy, would be brought down from the mandates as an occupation force. Such actions were feasible as long as the enemy controlled the sea approaches to the lower Solomons. Once these were lost, as they were in the mid-November engagements, the enemy was obliged to rely for reinforcements solely on the Tokyo Express. Meanwhile, air attacks on Henderson were carried out almost daily from Rabaul via Kahili, Field in southern Bougainville, and various harassments maintained against the American garrison. These latter were ingenious sleep destroyers. Oscar, a sub, surfaced nightly in the dark off Lunga, reconnoitred, threw a few shells at either Tulagi or Guadalcanal. After midnight, an asthmatic 2-engine bomber, variously named Louis the Louse, Washing Machine Charlie or Maytag Mike, would lay a stick of bombs across the field. The 67th performed its daily patrols at the dangerous medium altitude of 14,000 feet. The planes could struggle a little higher, but the pilots, without oxygen, could not make long sustained flights at this altitude. The P-400's days as an interceptor were numbered. On 29th August came the first test. The P-400s were scrambled at noon to meet 18 enemy bombers with the usual zero escort. 12 went up in flights of 4, climbed to 14,000, and, to quote the squadron's historian, staggered around, looking closely at all spots within their vision to make sure they were just spots and not enemy formations. The bombers rode safely above, at 17,000 until the Grummons hit them, knocking down 4 bombers and 4 escorts. The discouraged P-400s returned to a runway swarming with men. The strip seemed to have sprouted bushes. As it turned out, the ground crew were using them to mark bomb craters. Ammunition was exploding. Grass, hangars, and aircraft were afire, and scores of enemy snipers in the trees across the river. 30th August was a busy day. It began for the 67th at midnight. The SBDs had been sent on a hunt for enemy destroyers, and the Army pilots were continuously on the alert until dawn, when their regular duties began. That day, these consisted of maintaining combat air patrol over 4 friendly destroyers at Tulagi. The enemy raid was due at about noon, Tojo time, as it was known from the regularity with which the enemy appeared at that hour. The coast watchers reported 22 single-engine planes coming in from Buka Passage, and at 11:30 all aircraft came in for reservicing. It was reasoned that the Japanese would not send Zeros down alone, so the single-engine aircraft must be dive bombers and their target the ships at Tulagi. 8 Grummons and 11 P-400s were in commission and were disposed to meet the expected attack. 4 P-400s were to patrol over Tulagi and hop the dive bombers as they pulled out. 7 cruised the towering cumulus at 14,000 feet to engage the enemy as he started down. The Grummons were somewhat above the latter group. The 7 P-400s had been cruising for about 30 minutes and already were feeling lack of oxygen when they were attacked, not by dive bombers but by Zeros. The agile Japanese lived down around a cloud, climbed up to take the P-400s from behind and below. They numbered about 20. The P-400s had started turning into a Loughbury in which there were more Zeros than P-400s when the Grummons dived and the melee became general. The astonishing Zeros were making almost square turns, and the Army pilots found the only way to shake them was to head down for a cloud, make a turn on instruments, and come out on top, ready for a pass. Below, the weather over the sea had closed Clown to 1,000 feet and quarter-mile visibility, and consequently the 4-plane patrol started back. Coming out of a rain squall, the P-400s were attacked by a half-dozen Zeros and their formation torn apart. 2 of the pilots, Lieutenants R.E. Wythes and R.E. Chilson, did not return. Altogether, 4 P-400s were lost, 2 pilots later making their way to Henderson on foot after bailing out. 5 of the 7 returning planes were out of commission by reason of bullet holes. Against these losses, the 67th was credited with 4 slays. The Marines got 14. That did not end the day's activities. At 3 p.m., 17 F-4Fs and a dozen SBDs, with 2 escorting B-17s, arrived at Guadalcanal. 30 minutes later, with 18 planes on Henderson, the Japanese dive bombers arrived. Ignoring the tempting array on the airstrip, they caught the destroyer Blue a half-mile offshore and sank her. Across at Tulagi, the transport burrows ran aground and, to add to the commotion, nature intervened around 4:15 p.m., with 2 earthquakes. That evening, the Tokyo Express ran again, giving Henderson a shelling. Through all this, after but 4 days of operations at full strength, only 3 of the original 14 P-400s survived in commission on 1st September. The air battle of 30th August proved that the P-400s on Guadalcanal could not be used as interceptors. In addition to the planes shot down, 6 returned to Henderson that afternoon riddled beyond repair. The 67th had early been aware of the limitations of its planes, and the reports of the action of the 30th convinced General Harmon. No Army or Marine aircraft then extant was entirely satisfactory against the Zero, But the P-400s possessed a peculiar disadvantage in that they were unable to reach the altitude customarily employed by enemy bombers. Rate of climb was low, wing load excessive, and the engine extremely vulnerable to hits in the glycol cooling system. The P-400 had been flown under far from optimum conditions, but its pilots were skilled and courageous, as Major Smith, commanding VMF 223, later testified. General Harmon immediately asked Washington for P-38 and P-47 squadrons, or the P-40 with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Meanwhile, since the P-39 type was his mainstay in the theatre, the general cast about for ways of improving its performance. He considered that since .50 caliber bullets neatly disintegrated the Zeros, the 37mm nose cannon in the P-39 could be replaced by either a .50 caliber machine gun or a 20mm cannon. This would have the effect of lightening the plane. Washington showed equal concern over the record of the 67th and the specific dictum of General Vandergrift that the P-400 was entirely unsuitable for operations on Guadalcanal. But the war had to be fought with weapons presently available, and considerable numbers of P-39s were on their way to Pacific theaters. The recommended solution was stripping the fighter to lighten it. By the end of September, the P-39K minus 650 pounds of its original equipment had achieved a service ceiling of 27,000 feet, and the Bell aircraft's performance against the Japanese eventually reached heights far above that of the old P-400s, the clunkers, as the 67th dubbed them. Meantime, General Vandergrift at Guadalcanal faced the immediate problem. He had the undesirable aircraft on hand and had to find a use for it. The planes possessed good defensive armor plate and armament consisting of a 20mm cannon, 2.50 caliber and 4.30 caliber machine guns. They could each carry one bomb, and their engines operated reasonably well at low altitudes. The Japanese, moreover, had shown no extraordinary talent with flak. As an attack plane, then, the P-400 could use its bomb on shipping and shore installations, its 20mm cannon on landing barges, and its machine guns on enemy personnel. About 20 miles east of Henderson, the Japanese held the native village of Tasimboko in some strength. The Marines planned to bring fresh troops from Tulagi, effect a landing east of Tasimboko, strike the position from the rear, and retire the same day. In preparation for this operation, the P-400s tried their wings in a new employment. On the night of 1st September, 2 enemy transports and 2 destroyers lay off Tasimboko discharging troops. Foul weather having prevented the SBDs from interfering during darkness, Captain Brannan with 5 P-400s took off at 6 a.m. to attack landing parties in the area. None were found, but 5 beached landing craft were sighted. At 8 a.m., 4 more Army fighters took off. They dropped 500-pound bombs on the village and strafed both the landing craft and the village. Back on Henderson, Tojo time was imminent, and rather than sit out the attack, the P-400s returned to Tasimboko. In their absence, 18 bombers, escorted by 21 Zeros, came over Henderson. The F-4F-4s reduced their number by 3 bombers and 4 fighters, but the P-400s returned to a cratered runway, a burned-out hangar, 3 fired SBDs, burning gas and ammunition dumps, and a good many delayed action bombs. Such expeditions became routine with the 67th, which began to be known as the Jagdstaffel. The mechanics could always produce a pair of clunkers to go out and work over the Japanese. At first, the pilots chose their own targets, landing barges or supply dumps. Later they were sent out to bomb and strafe in the inlets and coves of Santa Isabel, where the enemy maintained jumping-off points for reinforcing Guadalcanal, and their bombing eventually became so accurate they could be assigned targets quite close to the marine lines. Day by day, the P-400s went up to Tasimboko while the Japanese bombed or shelled Henderson. On 4th September, with only 3 Army aircraft in commission and 13 pilots to fly them, word was received that the enemy was putting men ashore in landing barges up on Santa Isabel, 75 miles northwest of Henderson. Led by Major Robert E. Gaylor in his F-4F-4, the 3 P-400s were on their way by 2:40 p.m. The target was easily located in a small cove. 6 loaded landing craft were destroyed by 2 direct hits with 500-pounders, and the boats and men still landing were thoroughly strafed. Altogether, a total of 25 landing craft out of 30 seen in the area were claimed destroyed. That night, however, the Japanese retaliated with the Express, a light cruiser and 2 destroyers, sinking the American destroyer transports Little and Gregory off Savo. On the 5th, after all personnel on Henderson had undergone a dismal night of enemy shelling, the Jagstaffel and the Grummans uncovered a prime target. 15 fully loaded landing barges about 500 yards off the northwest coast of Guadalcanal. 6 Grummans and 2 P-400s strafed until ammunition was exhausted. An Army pilot may have had this mission in mind when he came back to report that he and his wingman had literally cut a X on the water through which Japanese troops were wading towards land. 2 hours later, 2 P-400s returned to destroy most of the supplies in the landing craft which had grounded on a reef close inshore. The Tasimboko operation, or rather raid, occurred on 8th September. Beginning at 7 a.m., 4 P-400s and 3 SBDs bombed the area for 10 minutes, with the object of pinning down the defenders while the attack party went ashore. At 9 a.m., the mission was repeated. At noon, help was again requested, the Marines having tackled a rather larger force than had been anticipated, and the P-400s responded at once. Nevertheless, at 3:30 p.m., the Marines asked that the P-400s cover their withdrawal. Meanwhile, intermittent thunder showers had made 6-inch mud of Henderson's runway. 3 of the P-400s were in commission and the pilots taxied them out. Captain Brannan lowered half flaps, held the brakes, and gave his engine full throttle. The plane crept forward. He wrestled it down the runway and staggered off. Less fortunate, Lieutenant V.L. head lurched and skidded, trying to pick up speed, muddy spray drenching the plane as it ploughed through pools of water. Torque almost pulled it off the strip. Realizing he was running out of runway, the pilot tried to hang it on the prop. The old P-400 stalled and hit, broke in 3, and caught fire. Lieutenant Head was able to get out, though badly burned. The 3rd pilot took off through the flame and smoke. For 2 hours, this lone pair of Army flyers covered the Marine withdrawal, doing lazy 8s over the beach while the boats were loaded and launched. When the last had got away, the P-400s came in on reserve gas and somehow in the twilight got down on the strip. By the time the Tasimboko raiders had returned, the Japanese were ready for a major attempt on the Marine positions. Their express had been running regularly. Their strength had been built to a peak. The Marine air establishment at Henderson was being whittled by operational losses and the necessity of daily interception. On 9th September, the F-4F-4s were down to 11. In anticipation of enemy thrusts, Marine air strength was substantially augmented on 11th September, and additional planes came in on the 13th. By the 12th, the Japanese had prepared a formidable push against the perimeter defense of the airfield. Bombers hit at Henderson by day, and cruisers and destroyers from the Express shelled it by night. A particularly heavy shelling occurred during the night of the 13th, supporting a 3-pronged attack on the Marines. 2 of the attacks were held, but the most vicious struck at the Lunga Ridge just south of the airfield, a position held by Colonel Merritt A., Edson's 1st Raider Battalion. All night the Japanese drove against the ridge. Colonel Edson's men were forced off the crest and down on the other side. Only the inner perimeter defense stood between the airstrip and the enemy. Snipers broke through, and the field was brought under mortar and artillery fire. Radio Tokyo announced that Guadalcanal was retaken. The 67th mustered 3 of its P-400s to aid the Marine counterattack on the 14th. At 7:30 a.m., Captain Thompson and Lieutenants B.W. Brown and B.E. Davis were dispatched to Vicious Ridge. They did not have to fly to an objective. They simply circled the field, visible at all times to their ground crew except when they dipped behind the low hill. Then the murderous chatter of their armament could be heard. They made repeated passes until enemy rifle and machine gun fire forced 2 of them down in dead-stick landings. The last simply ran out of ammunition. The Marines retook the hill and buried the enemy dead with a bulldozer. It was clear that the Japanese had shot their bolt in the night attack of the 13th. The American lodgment on Guadalcanal had survived another push. By now, the maligned P-400 had proved itself. General Vandergrift consistently used the plane against any position blocking his Marines. In fact, he even asked for more P-400s. Commander, Air, South Pacific Forces Chief of Staff, Captain Matt Gardner, testified to its effectiveness in strafing troops and landing barges. The Marines preferred to use their SBDs against the reinforcing vessels. The P-400 had found in ground-air cooperation its niche on Guadalcanal. In defiance of technical orders, the 67th developed its own technique of dive bombing. On the plane's instrument panel was the warning: do not release bomb when nose angle 30 degrees up or down, or when airspeed exceeds 280 miles per hour. The Jagdstaffel discovered that the bomb would release at 70 degrees and clear the propeller arc if a quick pressure on the stick was employed to pull the airplane away from the falling bomb. Dives averaged 300 and sometimes reached 500 miles per hour, unlike the SBDs, which pushed over at 15,000 to 17,000 feet. The P-400 started their dives at 5,000, released and pulled out right over the jungle, zigzagging over the palms to avoid ground fire, and returning to strafe where the latter revealed troop positions. The cover offered by the jungle and coconut groves effectively concealed the Japanese and distressed the Jagdstaffel, which often could not find the target or believe it had caused damage. Marine outposts reported enemy concentrations, which were shown the pilots on a map and indicated by panels in American-held territory. The P-400s dive-bombed the spot and came back to strafe blindly among the trees. Only occasionally did they catch a fleeting glimpse of a Japanese. However, the infantry, moving in, found bodies in abundance and sometimes silenced mortars, and captured diaries testified to the Japanese troopers' great fear of the long-nosed American planes. The Marine and Navy intelligence officers who briefed and interrogated the 67th employed this evidence to encourage the Army pilots, and the Jagdstaffel took heart. The routine of combat at Henderson Field began around noon. Enemy bombers would arrive, 18 to 24 strong, high in the sun in a perfect V of Vs, escorted by 20 or more Zeros in flights of 3. Coming down from Kahili or Buka fields, the formation would bend its course around the islands to avoid being spotted. Some 150 miles out of Henderson it would reach altitude, then come in fast, perhaps as fast as 250 miles per hour. As the warning came through, a captured rising sun flag, the signal to scramble, would shoot up at the pagoda. Every flyable aircraft would head through the craters for the runway. If the crew noticed a wind drop amid the dust, they knew the plane had run afoul of a dud hole or a small crater hidden in the tall grass. First planes on the runway took off first, 2 at a time, SBDs or P-400s. Once aloft, the Grummans, test firing, would climb for altitude while the SBDs and P-400s flew off to work over Japanese territory. The ground crew worked until the black flag went up. Then they would hit the foxholes. The 67th's ground crew shared the Marines' hardships on Guadalcanal, even voluntarily manning the forward foxholes on nights when a breakthrough seemed imminent. There were not enough of them for the job. They had few tools, no hoist equipment, and no new parts. Only 7 armourers had accompanied the original 14 planes. Refuelling in particular was a back-breaking job. Crew chiefs regularly slept under the P-400s in case individual Japanese were able to slip through the Marine lines. Nothing but combat materiel had accompanied the first flights to Guadalcanal. After their repulse on Lunga Ridge, the Japanese evidently retired to give the Guadalcanal problem some thought. The elements of their solution, however, did not at once differ importantly from the familiar pattern. The Tokyo Express still ran, and air raids on Henderson continued, as did the knife work in the bush and the activities of Maytag Mike. It was clear that decisive naval actions and the landing of heavy reinforcements were necessary to secure the Guadalcanal-Tulagi area. These were in the offing, but not immediately. The Marines, reinforced by a large convoy on 18th September, made their preparations. The 11th Group on Espiritu and the 67th at Henderson carried on. In retrospect, October was the crucial month in the Solomons. Though initially surprised, the Japanese had reacted vigorously to the American thrust. To begin with, off Savo Island their guns uncovered the marine lodgements. Next, to exploit this advantage, they dispatched in late August a powerful task force which the Navy turned back in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The Japanese gradually built up strength which they expended at Lunga Ridge in mid-September. October saw the near triumph of their tactics. They all but broke the American forces on Guadalcanal. On 26 September, when the correspondent Richard Tregaskis departed Guadalcanal, he first went north to Bougainville in an Army B-17. The plane probably belonged to Colonel Saunders' 11th Group, although a new squadron, the 72nd of the 5th Group, had recently arrived in the area. Tregaskis furnished a good description of a routine B-17 search mission. The fort he was in left Guadalcanal towards dawn and headed over Tulagi Bay for the northwest. The navigator, explaining that no excitement was imminently likely, took off his shirt to acquire a tan. Not until the plane turned on, a Bougainville bearing was the first enemy aircraft seen. 2 Zeros made a tentative pass. Later, an enemy cargo ship went into violent maneuvers as the fort approached. A float Zero got too close and the .50 caliber sent her down for a dead stick landing. Meanwhile, the navigator counted and identified the ships below, and the bombardier decided that the flak which thwacked against the fuselage was from naval guns. Another Zero made a single frontal attack on the fortress, without either aircraft sustaining damage. The rest of the journey back to Espiritu was without incident. Throughout September and October, such missions were the principal occupation of Colonel Saunders' command in order to keep Commander, South Pacific Area informed of enemy surface movements. Statistics of operations for those months reveal twice as many search as bombing sorties. From Espiritu Santo, the sectors fanned northwesterly in narrow arcs of 6 degrees each and extended approximately 800 miles with a 100-mile width at the extremity. The maximum coverage included Rakata Bay on Santa Isabel and Gizo Bay in the New Georgia Group. When possible to stage through Henderson, the range increased to the Buin Shortland Fazy area, where the bombers could keep an eye on freight moving down from Rabaul, or the Mandates. These were long flights, averaging more than 1,500 miles, 12 weary hours for the crew. Occasionally, the forts went even farther, to Quieta on Bougainville's eastern shore and then around to touch the Buka Passage. On such lengthy missions, it was not always possible to carry bombs, but extra fuel and reduced bomb loads were the rule. Targets abounded at Bougainville's lower tip, where the harbour of Tonolé and Buin settlement lay behind densely wooded Shortland Island, and in the slot, funneling down to Guadalcanal between the New Georgia Group and Santa Isabel and Choiseul to the east. Tonolé, protected by Kahili Field, received shipping from Rabaul, Palau and Truk, while sightings in the slot included every category in the Japanese Navy. Unfortunately, it was not easy to hit shipping. Destroyers were most numerous in the slot, but they were extremely maneuverable and almost defied direct hits. The slower cargo vessels, offering easier targets, were nevertheless far from sitting ducks for a single search plane. Infrequently, a task force was sighted, battleships, cruisers and escorts, and on 14 September, 250 miles north of the Santa Cruz Group, 7 B-17s uncovered such a force, 3 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, and a number of lighter craft moving to the northwest. Through intense and accurate flak, 2 possible hits were claimed. Weather remained a formidable enemy, aborting a strike on 11 September by 7 forts against a sizable naval force at Tonolé, and again turning back 15 B-17s tracking a carrier reported northeast of the Santa Cruz Group. In this last search, 3 forts crash-landed at sea. 2 of the crew reached the northern tip of New Caledonia and were later rescued. The third drifted 7 days at sea, lost 2 of its members to exposure, was finally rescued by the Navy. By 20th September, the 11th Group had sighted 155 vessels of all types during 7 weeks of operation. It had bombed 19 and hit 4. Of these, 2 were sunk. The scale of attack was always light, 1 attack by 4 planes, 4 by 3, 4 by 2, and 10 by single search planes. To increase the striking power of the B-17s, another squadron was dispatched from Hawaii in mid-September. Necessary maintenance personnel moved out of Oahu on the 21st in LB-30s, early versions of the Liberator. By 23rd September, the B-17Es of the 5th Group's 72nd Squadron had arrived in Espiritu, and on the 24th some of them were already up over Shortland Island. In mid-October, 2 additional squadrons of the 5th Group were dispatched to the South Pacific. For all practical purposes, the 5th Squadrons operated as part of the 11th, an arrangement recognized in December by the establishment of a joint headquarters for the 2 groups. Eager was the adjective for the pilots of the 11th, who showed a reckless tendency to use the big bombers as attack planes. The gunners were fond of strafing, and the pilots obligingly took the B-17s down over the ground and dock installations at Gizo, or over the float planes and flying boats at Rakata Bay. On 16th September, 5 separate strafing attacks were run over Rakata Bay, and 3 days later the docks at Gizo were treated similarly. Such employment of heavy bombers disturbed General Harmon, and he informed headquarters that he was putting a curb to such activities. The overall tactical situation at Guadalcanal determined, that is, limited, the effectiveness of General Harmon's heavy bombers. Although a fort had come in to stay overnight as early as 25th August, Henderson was never stocked with enough fuel to permit continuous operations by B-17s. It was not stocked with fuel because the enemy controlled the waters of the Lower Solomons. The Tokyo Express ran often, fast, and at considerable strength. One way to hamper the Express was to hit hard at Tonolei and Buka, but the gas for these missions had to be picked up at Henderson, and Henderson ordinarily lacked it until after the middle of November. Moreover, the field, shelled almost nightly and bombed almost daily, was too exposed for heavy bombers and suffered as well from lack of service personnel. During the first 3 months of the campaign, the Marines cheerfully took on a great part of the burden of servicing the B-17s, which came in from time to time. By October, Henderson had its Marston mat, but General Harmon doubted that the field could support heavy bomber operations. Taxiways and hard standings were lacking, dispersion was poor, and rain was likely to bring operations to a soggy halt. Nevertheless, in the first part of October, an attempt was made to restrict the use of Buka, which the Japanese employed as an advanced staging point for Rabaul-based bombers. As early as 2nd September, 40 bombers and fighters had been reported on the field. On 4th October, only one B-17 could bore through the weather to drop a score of 100-pounders on the strip and parkways. 8 days later, another mission hit the field more solidly. The bombs splashed along the runway and 10 parked aircraft were assessed as destroyed. Only 2 Zeros rose from the surprised airdrome, and only 1 got back. On the 13th, 6 more forts repeated the mission, putting 6 tons on the Buka Strip. The day when the Guadalcanal gas supply could back up a sustained offensive still lay in the future. During late September and early October, the Japanese continued to run the Express, filtering reinforcements into Guadalcanal at a low but steady rate. Marine Air at Henderson enjoyed only limited success in coping with it. The Express did not get within range until late afternoon. Ordinarily, only one strike could be accomplished before nightfall, and weather often interfered. But, whenever moon and clouds permitted, the dive and torpedo bombers roared out for night attacks. Back at Espiritu, Colonel Saunders found himself at a more serious disadvantage. By the time his B-17s could cover the distance to Guadalcanal, the Express would be out of range and dispersed up the slot. On 5th October, another method of derailing the Express was tried. The Hornet was dispatched to the north of the Solomons chain. Her aircraft struck at Quieta and depots in the Shortland area, and at Faisi hit hard at a naval force preparing for a southward voyage. Still that night the Express made its run, and on succeeding nights as well. But on 11th October it met disaster at the other end of the line. Army reinforcements were moving up to Guadalcanal in the second week of October, partly to cover the flank of this convoy, but expressly to seek battle with Japanese units on the Guadalcanal run. A task force under Rear Admiral Norman Scott went hunting in the Solomons. The eyes of this force were the B-17s covering Bougainville's southern tip. Current search routine of the B-17s was roughly as follows. 4 planes departed daily from Espiritu and Henderson Field. Those from Espiritu took off at 5 a.m., searched 1,000 miles between 294 degrees and 324 degrees, then landed at Henderson. Next morning, out of Guadalcanal, these same forts covered an arc 450 miles deep between 3,000 and 3,400, flying to within 50 miles of Rabaul. Weather permitting, this was efficient coverage. To hinder such activity, the Japanese brought a fresh and highly trained fighter unit into the Shortland area. On occasion, the B-17s went farther afield, on 2nd October to Kapinga Marangi Greenwich Island, where photos were taken and the area strafed. On 11 October, Admiral Scott's cruiser force, San Francisco, Salt Lake City, Helena, and Boise, 2 heavies and 2 lights, with attendant destroyers, cruised off Rennell Island, out of range of Japanese air search but within 5 hours steaming of Savo. At 1:45 p.m., Henderson reported search planes had discovered 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers southbound down the slot. Further information on Japanese naval movement was denied by intensive air raids on Henderson during the afternoon. Calculating that the enemy should be off Savo an hour before midnight, Admiral Scott bore north, expecting to meet only the force reported during the early afternoon. Although the enemy's armada proved considerably more substantial, that fact served only to increase Japanese losses in the night action which succeeded. The Battle of Cape Esperance cost the Imperial Navy 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 5 destroyers, and an auxiliary. Another heavy cruiser and various destroyers were damaged. Our own losses were 100 to 5 dead and a number wounded. The destroyer Duncan was lost. Cape Esperance not only failed to stop the Express, it hardly gave it pause. However, 4,000 United States Army troops of Major General Alexander M. Patch's Americal Division were subsequently put ashore in time to face the Japanese fury, which thenceforth increased in scale and effectiveness. The enemy was working up to another big push. He began by virtually knocking out the Guadalcanal aerodrome. At Henderson, the 67th Fighter Squadron had been continuing its strafing and bombing. New pilots had arrived. Most of the original group were dead or back in the rear areas. New planes P-39D1s and P-39Ks were coming in, being assembled, tested, and flown up to Guadalcanal, just as the old P-400s had made the journey in August. The 9th of October was a routine day. The field was muddy. 6 P-400s were scheduled for a mission against the Cocumbona area to the west. Taxiing in the mud, 1 P-400 broke off a nose wheel. Another sustained 2 flat tires. A third simply got stuck. Still another plane proved to have a rough engine. The remaining P-400s bombed and strafed for an hour near a bridge west of Cocumbona, and at 11 a.m., 4 pilots returned to bomb. The enemy air raid at Tojo time failed to materialize. Earlier in the day, the new P-39s had made their debut up in the New Georgia area, accompanying SBDs in an attack on Japanese ships. Of the float planes sent up to interfere, the P-39s shot down 1 certain and 2 probables without loss to themselves. Late in the afternoon, the P-39s, using 1 to 100-pound incendiaries and demolition bombs, worked over the Maravovo district beyond Cape Esperance. In the succeeding 3 days, the pattern was largely repeated. On the 10th, the P-39s went twice up to the New Georgia area as escort for SBDs on ship strikes. On the 11th, the 67th lost 1 pilot and was credited with 1 bomber in a scrap with Tokyo 30 bombers and 20 Zeros carrying out the usual noon-hour raid. On the 12th, ground troops were again harassed. The P-39s flew top cover for TBFs and SBDs, which went up after 3 destroyers in the slot, and 2 P-39s cracked up in takeoffs from the muddy field. On this day, however, a new note was added. A Japanese field piece began dropping shells in the dispersal area. Admiral Scott had chastened the Express on the night of the 11th. Colonel Saunders' B-17s, returning from Buka on the 13th, stopped over at Tonale long enough to score a direct hit on a transport and shoot down 6 of 26 attacking fighters. The American Division's 164th Infantry was disembarking at Lunga Point. The morning of the 13th, the 67th attacked landing barges which the enemy had beached during the night at the western end of Guadalcanal. At noon, the air raid came. The Bettys were scarcely intercepted. The P-400s watched the show above from 12,000 feet. The P-39s struggled to 27,000 and still were 3,000 feet low, and insufficient warning prevented the F-4Fs from making contact in force. At 2 p.m., while the fighters sat being refueled and rearmed, another wave of Japanese bombers made an appearance and was able to bomb at will, damaging aircraft at Henderson and causing casualties among the 164th Infantry, still moving ashore. More serious, the Japanese field piece had again begun to lob shells, this time into the area around the end of the runway. The Seabees of the 6th Battalion had been racing up and down the strip with pre-cut mast and mat and preloaded dump trucks prepared for the expected craters, but their efforts had barely kept the field in operation. Pilots and mechanics were crawling from their foxholes to ready the P-400s for another mission, to track down Pistol Pete, as the gun had already been named. Suddenly the mission was called off. No gas! Just before midnight came the main event. First, the noise of a small plane overhead. Then 3 flares, a red one for the west end of the runway, green for the east, and white in the centre. The men were scarcely in the foxholes when bedlam broke loose. Off Guadalcanal stood an express consisting of 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 8 destroyers. For over 2 hours the bombardment continued. Runway and dispersal area were brought under fire. After a thorough pattern shelling, the enemy shifted to the campsites in the palm grove. Gas and ammunition dumps took hits, and all over the field aircraft went up in smoke and flame. For whole minutes the area was bright as day from the flares. The Japanese let up long enough to cool their guns, then it began again. At 3:15 a.m. the express stood for home. 3 bombers came overhead and dropped their sticks. Then 3 more, and so on until dawn. The morning of the 14th lit up a shambles. Tents were collapsed or shrapnel-riddled. The aerial defences were seriously reduced. In all, 57 aircraft had been destroyed or damaged. To meet the express, 4 SBDs remained, but no TBFs. To meet the Tojo time raid, only a few Wildcats. The 67th had been fortunate, 2 P-39s damaged and none of the P-400s even hit. A few barrels of aviation gas remained. On the 13th, Colonel Saunders' B-17s had been bombing over Buka and Tonolé, had returned to Henderson, where 2 of the forts were so sieved that night by shrapnel that they had to be abandoned. In the midst of the post-raid rubble and confusion, Colonel Saunders led out his remaining B-17s. Less than 2,000 feet of Henderson's runway was usable, but the bombers took off for Espiritu in 1,800 feet, drawing 70 inches of pressure without a cylinder blowing out. On instructions from Marine Headquarters, officers of the 67th went through the 2 derelict B-17s, destroying radios, maps, charts, and confidential papers, and biding the Norden sites. For the time, Henderson was useless as a heavy bombardment base. In fact, Henderson was very nearly useless for any type of aircraft. Pistol Pete, actually a number of guns, went into action again. His range, short at first, improved with practice, most of the shells landing in the area where the 67th planes were parked. They came irregularly, about 2 every quarter hour. As fast as the Seabees tackled a crater, another shell would whine over and dig at the same spot, scattering men and equipment. Still, the Seabees tamped, filled and laid mat, and for a time kept part of the field in operation. Providentially, back in September, they had laid out a grass strip 2,000 yards distant from and parallel with Henderson. Although rough and short, this strip supported the light planes during the critical mid-October days. In an effort to silence Pete, 4 P-400s were hung with 100-pound bombs. The pilots, parachutes strapped on, crouched in nearby foxholes. One at a time, between the bursts, they ran for their planes. Drunkenly, they taxied out, careened down the runway with new craters pocking the surface behind them. All got off but failed to silence Pistol Pete, who was numerous, concealed, and frequently moved. Lack of fuel precluded further raids against him. Every drop was saved for fighter defense. Enemy pressure was relentless. At 11:54 a.m., and again at 3 p.m., enemy bombers and fighters struck, without warning or interception. Bomb craters could be filled, but the Seabees fell behind in their race with peat. By afternoon of the 14th, Henderson Field was knocked out. Down from headquarters, shortly after noon, came a Marine colonel. His words were reminiscent of the Philippines. "We do not know whether we will be able to hold the field or not. There is a Japanese task force of destroyers, cruisers, and troop transports headed our way. We have enough gasoline left for one mission against them. Load your airplanes with bombs and go out with the dive bombers and hit them. After the gas is gone, we will have to let the ground troops take over. Then your officers and men will attach yourselves to some infantry outfit. Good luck and goodbye." At 2:25 p.m. then, 4 P-39s, each with a 300-pound bomb, and 3 old P-400s with 100-pounders took off with the 4 SBDs. Henderson had few teeth left to show the express. 150 miles of precious fuel was burned before the planes sighted the Japanese task force off the coast of Santa Isabel. 6 transports in line astern, well screened by 8 destroyers and cruisers, 4 on each flank. The Armada manoeuvred violently, threw up heavy flak. The composite attack group pushed over and went down. No planes were lost, but no hits were seen. Someone recalled the abandoned B-17s. The gas siphoned out of their tanks proved enough for one more strike, and for this one old P-400, saddled with 500-pound bombs, barely wobbled off the runway. This time the SBDs scored 2 hits on the Japanese force, by now at the near tip of Santa Isabel. The 67th lost 1 plane over the target, and another to a night landing crash back at Henderson. It was a glum prospect as darkness set in over the marine beachhead. Another shelling was a certainty. The enemy ships were anchored between Cocumbona and Tassafaronga, only 10 miles down the channel, busily unloading troops and supplies, a prime target for an airstrike, but no gas. However, the shelling, which started at 1 a.m., though heavy, lasted but a short time. Newly arrived PT boats out in Sleepless Lagoon, contributing to the premature withdrawal of the express, and gasoline was on the way. By mid-morning it began to arrive, ferried in by the workhorse C-47s. For over a week Henderson was to depend on the fuel brought in by this service, maintained by 2 Marine Transport Squadrons and the Army Air Force's 13th Troop Carrier Squadron. All day long on the 15th the transports came in from Espiritu, each with about 12 drums, enough to keep 12 planes in the air for 1 hour. They braked to a skidding stop, the drums were rolled out, and the planes took off before Pistol Pete could lob a shell. With gas on hand, Henderson prepared to hit back. Battered planes were patched. Pilots belted their own ammunition, and armament crew shouldered the formidable task of bombing up the planes without bomb carts. 10 men hoisted a 500-pound bomb on a truck bed, hauled to the vicinity of the plane, then rolled through the mud. The bombs were lifted and fitted into the racks by as many men as could crowd under the aircraft's belly. All this on empty stomachs. With the cooks in the foxholes, it had been hardtack and cold hash since the 13th. Down the beach were numerous targets. Between Cocumbona and Doma Reef, 5 transports and 8 destroyers were pouring ashore upwards of 10,000 troops. No infiltration this, but invasion in force, with a constant patrol of Zeros over the ships. All day on the 15th, the Henderson aircraft smashed at the convoy. No sooner were the planes airborne than objectives were visible, and waiting Zeros swept down on the Army and Marine planes starting their dives. The destroyers contributed heavy flak. In this situation, the technique of the P-39s and P-400s shaped up somewhat as follows. They tried to disregard enemy fighters, dived, released when the ship was dead center in the gun sight, pulled out over the mast, and zigzagged out of the ack-ack. Then to Henderson for another load. Results were encouraging. One of the 67th's pilots got a probable, 2 others scored hits which damaged 2 transports. Still, another dropped on a transport which caught fire, exploded, and sank. The air score was even 1-0 for one pilot of the 67th. Altogether, the fighter squadron sent 3 missions up the beach on the 15th, and in addition weathered the usual high-level Tojo time raid. The forts also had a hand in the battle. On the 14th, 6 had come up from Espiritu to pound the Express, but lost it in the darkness of Indispensable Strait. On the 15th, 11 of them, now back, possibly damaged a transport and fired what was thought to be a light cruiser. Of the 20 Zeros covering the landing operation, the bombers knocked down nearly half, and though many sustained major damage, all the forts made the 640 miles back to Espiritu. The night of the 15th, Henderson Field absorbed a shelling by a cruiser, but in the morning the enemy task force had left. 3 of its transports lay blazing hulks on the beach, but troops, armament, and supplies had gone ashore. Harassment of these reinforcements became a principal mission of the Henderson-based aircraft. As often as they could be refueled and rearmed, P-39s, P-400s, and SBDs went down to Kokumbona. The F-4 F-4s made the daily Japanese raids a costly business. On the 23rd, for instance, 24 Grummans, intercepting 16 bombers and 25 fighters, shot down 20 Zeros and 2 bombers with no losses. These days, prelude to a big enemy push, were utter weariness to the 67th. Repeated missions multiplied the work of men forced by repeated bombings and shelling to spend most of their time in foxholes. Sleep and sufficient food were always lacking. Planes were wearing out. One day, 4 P-400s took the air. The first had a bomb, but only one .30 caliber machine gun functioning. Number 2 had a bomb and no functioning armament. Numbers 3 and 4 had most of their guns in commission, but no bombs, personnel, cracked under the strain. On the 18th, officers and men, affected by repeated bombings, were evacuated to New Caledonia. Apparently the Japanese were sanguine of the outcome. Their German allies announced that 2 important airfields had been captured from United States forces in the Solomons. In Washington, Secretary Knox hinted at the seriousness of the situation. The main strip at Henderson was only recurrently in operation, despite prodigious efforts to erase the pockmarks. Up in the northern Solomons, the Japanese marshalled cargo and warships, and the Express ran on the nights of the 16th, 18th, and 20th, destroyers and cruisers feeding the units ashore with foreboding regularity. The new commander, South Pacific Area, Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., soberly prepared to counter a thrust by sea. Decision, however, was reached on land. The Japanese plan envisaged simultaneous attacks, eastward across the Matanikau and from a point south of the airfield. Day was 23rd October. For days before, patrols probed the American lines, but the grand attack, from the Japanese point of view, was bungled. The attacks were delivered separately, and separately they were beaten back. The Matanikau action proceeded on schedule, if not according to plan. 10 tanks and thousands of fresh troops, with ample artillery support, were thrown against the defenders. 4 times on the 23rd, the enemy lashed at positions held by the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 5th Marines. American half-tracks mounting 75s knocked out the tanks one by one as they attempted to cross the Matanikau, and the Marines picked off about 2,000 Japanese troops. Undaunted, the enemy repeated the effort at dawn of the 24th. The P-400s went over, bombing and strafing the enemy lines, and all through the day recurrent attacks were checked, although heavy afternoon rains grounded the planes at Henderson. At 8 a.m. on the Pete, 25th, the men on Henderson Field were surprised to find 5 Zeros circling above their strip, making no effort to strafe. Soon this number swelled to 14 and a medium bomber, all awaiting the signal to land, apparently under the impression that the field was in Japanese hands. No signal came, and as soon as the mud had dried sufficiently, 8 Grummans left the field and shot down the whole force. The Express had put in an appearance during the early morning. 1 heavy cruiser, 1 light cruiser, and 4 destroyers landed troops and supplies and began to support with shell-fire enemy attacks on the embattled beachhead. The SBDs and the 67th went after this force, making 4 separate attacks. At 2:20 p.m., Lieutenants Dinn, Purnell and Jacobson in P-39s caught the ships northeast of Florida Island, barely missing them with 500-pound bombs. 2 hours later, these three and Captain Mitchell attacked once more, Lieutenant Jacobson putting his bomb squarely on the heavy cruiser. Near misses on the light cruiser were obtained, and the warships, trailing oil slicks, moved slowly off. On the 25th, the enemy staged his attack from the south, striking along Lunga Ridge. Although the Marines and the 164th Infantry piled the attackers 6 deep, a night attack broke through until some enemy elements stood close to the south side of Henderson. The morning of the 26th, a desperate American counter-attack cleared the field. 3 of the old P-400s and 2 P-39s did their bit, bombing and strafing the area south of the grass fighter strip. The counter-attack of the morning of the 26th, as it turned out, ended the Japanese threat by land, but a major sea action was brewing. In the Japanese plans, possession of Henderson Field was apparently a prerequisite to a grand attack on Guadalcanal, with the strip harbouring friendly carrier planes instead of the redoubtable Grummons, SBDs, P-39s, and P-400s. Additional troops could be safely brought in for a mop-up. The Japanese fleet, meanwhile, could be expected to see that the American Navy did not interfere. Appreciation of the enemy intentions clarifies the role of the carrier action of 26 October, known as the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. The success of their land drive on 25 October must have made the capture of Henderson seem only a matter of hours to the Japanese, and down from the Mandates moved a force formidable enough to clinch the argument. Admiral Halsey had scraped his Pacific resources to meet it. The Enterprise and the New South Dakota were rushed down from Pearl Harbor, where the former had been recovering from wounds received in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. With the Hornet, these two composed the nucleus of the force with which Rear Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid was skirting the Santa Cruz Islands on 26 October, ready to intercept whatever enemy forces the Mandates might offer. On that day, the search planes B-17s and PBYs were out from Espiritu. East of Malaita, Lieutenant Mario Sesso of the 5th Group located one section of the Japanese force, which mustered 4 carriers and 4 battleships, with a wealth of escort, transports, and auxiliaries. During a half-hour's observation, Lieutenant Sesso developed his report until it included a battleship, several cruisers, destroyers, and a possible carrier. 7 carrier-borne Nagoya Zeros attempted to interfere. 2 fell away smoking, and 1 disintegrated in a frontal attack. The fortress suffered failure of the lower turret and loss of 1 gun in the tail, another in the upper turret. The Zeros annihilated the bombardier, but the fort came back and the report got through to the fleet. In the Santa Cruz action, the Japanese, by destroying the Hornet, reduced the American carriers in the South Pacific to the again damaged Enterprise. They had sustained damage to 2 carriers themselves, as well as to a Congo-class battleship, but it is unlikely that this punishment prompted their withdrawal. The American troops on Guadalcanal stood fast. Henderson's aircraft could still hit at an occupation force. The Japanese, consistently enough, withdrew. The beachhead actually had saved itself. On one of the last days of October 1942, the United States Navy's submarine Amberjack slipped cautiously into Tulagi. Her mission, cargo, and passengers were not usual for a submarine, but well attuned to the Solomons campaign, in which almost anything was more than likely to happen. The Amberjack's spare fuel tanks carried aviation gasoline. Henderson still suffered from insufficient gas. She carried torpedoes for the Tulagi-based PT boats. Guadalcanal still suffered from the visits of the Express. She carried, in addition, Army Air Forces personnel, 15 airplane mechanics and armourers for the worn 67th Fighter Squadron, which had always suffered from lack of manpower. After their big push, the Japanese had receded somewhat, and the situation on Guadalcanal showed some improvement. The Express still ran, although harassed by the 24 submarines. Commander, South Pacific Area, operated in the area, and by the pilots from Henderson, whose 2 strips had recovered from the ravages of October. General Vandergrift's Marines celebrated by striking across the Matanikau on 30th October. For a change, American warships, the light cruiser Atlanta and 4 destroyers, stood offshore in support. By 3rd November, the Marines were beyond Point Cruz. However, on the night of 2nd November, the industrious Japanese landed 1,500 men east of Coley Point and the American push to the west was checked. On 4th November, the San Francisco, Helena, and Sterett obligingly shelled this force, which because of subsequent attentions by the Marines never seriously threatened American positions. The 67th was carrying the war to the enemy in its own way. On the 3rd of November, for instance, 2 pilots bombed anti-aircraft artillery emplacements at Cocumbona. 2 more were up over the hills on reconnaissance, and, since intelligence had reported Japanese troops east of the Tenaru, the afternoon was devoted to bombing and strafing this region. The pilots went out in pairs, dropping 100 and 500-pound bombs, and returning with numerous bullet holes in their craft. The routine was not light. Usually 4 or 5 missions were run, but on some days the total might rise to 12 or more. As the newer P-39s arrived, they were frequently dispatched to escort Marine strike forces, or as dive bombers in company with the SBDs. One of the missions of 3rd November had the following participants: 15 SBDs, 4 P-39s, 2 P-400s, 1 TBF, and 7 F-4Fs, all out after the Japanese who had come ashore near Coley Point. Such conglomerations constituted the primary weapon against the Express. The afternoon of 7th November, 11 southbound Japanese warships were sighted northeast of Santa Isabel, and the composite force went into action. Out from Henderson flew 7 SBDs with 1,000-pounders, 3 torpedo-laden TBFs, and 8 P-39s lugging 500-pound bombs, the whole escorted by 22 Wildcats. The Army pilot's instructions specified they were first to bomb the warships, identified as 1 light cruiser and 10 destroyers, pull out, and join the Grummons as high cover. However, the P-39s were held up on the takeoff and were overtaking the rest of the formation when they saw 3 float Zeros and 2 float biplanes about to attack 2 F-4Fs. Jettisoning their bombs, the P-39s shot down all 5. Ahead, the strike was succeeding. The TBFs put 2 torpedoes into the cruiser and 1 into a destroyer, while the SBDs planted a 1,000-pounder on the cruiser. In the air battle, the enemy lost 15 float planes, the Marines 4 F-4Fs. The B-17s continued their searches from Espiritu. Daily 6 were out, occasionally 8 to provide a broader coverage. Air opposition had for the time diminished, but to vary the routine there might be a surfaced sub to strafe or a flight of float Zeros to dispute the passage. So far as bombing was concerned, without the necessary fuel at Henderson, the B-17s could not get up to Buintonole, from where the Japanese would mount any further offensive. That the Japanese were contemplating such an offensive was obvious. By 9th November, reports of concentrations began to come in. As of 12th November, when the battle was already underway, estimates put the enemy's strength at 2 carriers, 4 battleships, 5 heavy cruisers, and all the escort and shipping needed for a major attempt on Guadalcanal. Against such a force, Admiral Halsey's resources were slim, his principal units being the apparently indestructible Enterprise, under repair, the Washington, and the South Dakota. Additional complication was the fact that Commander, South Pacific Area, was required not only to turn the Japanese thrust, but to put Army and Marine reinforcements on Guadalcanal. To aid the Guadalcanal garrison, these reinforcements had to be landed on the island and unloaded before the Japanese boiled down from Buin in any great strength. Moreover, the transports had to be safely removed again. Time was extremely short, and the whole operation distinctly ticklish. Fortunately, Admiral Turner, in charge of supplying Guadalcanal, had developed a fairly accurate estimate of the chronology of Japanese moves. The predicted enemy timetable ran somewhat like this: land-based bombing of Henderson starting on 10th November, naval bombardment on the night of the 11th, a carrier air attack on the field on the 12th, with naval bombardment and landings that night. The invasion force was expected on Friday, the 13th. Since the United States transports had to clear Guadalcanal by Thursday night, cargo vessels were to be off Lunga Point at dawn of Wednesday, the 11th. Transports from Noumea would arrive Thursday morning. The escorts of these groups, combined under Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan, were to deal with any Japanese naval force poking around in Sleepless Lagoon. A great deal depended on the speed of unloading and on the Japanese doing nothing unexpected. The cargo vessels moved in on schedule and commenced unloading. At 9:35 a.m., they were attacked and slightly damaged by dive-bombing Aichi 99s, the Marines losing 6 planes in the fight with bombers and escort. At 11:27 a.m., the high-level raid occurred. 8 of the 67th's pilots were forced to sit this one out at 12,000, while the Marines went up to destroy 6 of the raiders. That night, Admiral Callahan swept Savo Sound without incident. The American transports anchored off Kukum Beach at 5:30 a.m. on Thursday the 12th, screened by cruisers and destroyers. At 1:40 p.m., on warning of an approaching enemy formation, the ships got underway and formed in anti-aircraft disposition. High above the island, concealed in a cloud, waited Captain Joe Foss and his Grummans. Not far below cruised 8 P-39s ready, after their bombing and strafing routine, for aerial combat. The combination of naval anti-aircraft guns and Henderson's fighters proved lethal to the Japanese airmen. At 5:02 p.m., upwards of 20 torpedo bombers appeared low from behind Florida Island. In a long line abreast, they headed for the transports, 8 Zeros covering. Diving into the combat, the P-39s found their canopies covered with mist as warmer air was reached, and one pilot, blinded, continued down into the sea. He was the 67th's only loss as against 1 Zero and 1 torpedo bomber to its credit. Altogether, 3 Zeros, and 1 torpedo plane got away. None of the American ships sustained serious damage. Scout planes up the slot, meanwhile, had discovered that the Japanese were moving down a task force, probably with the intention of attacking the transports off Guadalcanal, and towards evening the latter were accordingly withdrawn. Then Admiral Callahan headed back for Savo, where he fought against odds, one of the wildest night actions in naval history. Both sides suffered heavily, the Japanese more heavily, and Henderson took no shelling that night. Thus far the defence had succeeded, but the main Japanese onslaught had not yet been met. To counter it, the Enterprise, South Dakota and Washington had moved out from Noumea on the 11th. Commander, South Pacific Area began to concentrate land-based aircraft on Guadalcanal. Fresh SBDs, TBFs and Wildcats were flown in, and on 12th November, at 3:30 p.m., something new was added. 8 Lightnings landed on the fighter strip just east of Henderson. There is a pleasant story about the advent of these P-38s. It holds that as the Marines on the field spotted the Army pilots climbing out of their formidable fighters, they cheered wildly and rushed out to greet them, with reason, for old friends had come. Leading the flight was Major Dale Brannan, who back in August had brought the first P-400s, the clunkers, into the strip the Japanese had begun. With him were other former 67th pilots, veterans of the Jagdstaffel. The 8 P-38s belonged to the 339th Fighter Squadron. Late in August, it had been decided to activate a fighter group in New Caledonia to comprise the 67th, 68th, and 70th Fighter Squadrons, and another yet to be activated. By the end of September, the orders had gone out. On 3rd October, the 347th Fighter Group and the 339th Fighter Squadron were officially in existence. Escadra 4. The 339th, the old 67th, provided 29 officers and 106 enlisted men, with Major Brannan in command. With him to the new organization passed the 4 lieutenants who had accompanied him on the pioneer hop to Guadalcanal. Command of the 67th went to Captain John A. Thompson, who had headed the second flight of P-400s from New Caledonia. In September, General Harmon acquired P-38s diverted from General Kenny's command. These were assigned to the 339th. During October, the Lightnings were held in New Caledonia. Training was not yet complete and frequency of naval bombardments of Henderson too high to risk the new fighters on Guadalcanal. By mid-November, however, they were ready to move. On the morning of the 12th, the P-38s had left Tontuta at 7 a.m., escorted by a B-17. Upon landing at Espiritu after 3.5 hours' flight, mechanics discovered that low fuel consumption would have permitted a non-stop flight to Guadalcanal. The pilots, however, already showed fatigue. En route to Henderson, radio report of an enemy attack was received. and the B-17 carrying the ground personnel turned back at the southern end of San Cristobal. Consequently, when the planes landed, the Marines turned to and serviced them. On the 13th, additional Army Air Forces reinforcements arrived. 8 more P-38s from the 5th Air Force, flying in non-stop from Milne Bay. Dawn of Friday, the 13th, found the Japanese battleship Hiei limping northwest of Savo. A casualty of the encounter with Admiral Callahan, she became the main preoccupation of the American planes in the combat area. First blood was drawn by the Enterprise, which was cruising south of Guadalcanal with a damaged No. 1 elevator. The carrier decided to ease operations by sending some of her planes to Henderson Field. 9 TBFs and 6 fighters flew off, and at 11 a.m. sighted the Hiei, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers headed for Guadalcanal, perhaps to finish off the Portland, lying off Lunga Point. The TBFs promptly put 3 fish into the battleship. Shortly afterward, 17 forts arrived. These had departed Espiritu at 5 a.m. and had subsequently been ordered to attack a carrier and a battleship reported by a search B-17. The indicated targets were out of range, and the bombers proceeded to Guadalcanal, where they found the Hiei circling slowly with her escorts. Despite heavy anti-aircraft artillery fire, 1 sure hit was obtained and 5 probables. All day long, Marine and Navy aircraft at Guadalcanal hammered the Hiei, the 67th providing top cover with 4 of its planes. By evening, however, the battleship was still afloat. It is probable that the Hiei was towed into position to assist in the bombardment of Henderson Field that night. The shelling, carried out by destroyers and cruisers as well, lasted 80 minutes until interrupted by the PT boats from Tulagi. On the field, 1 SBD and 2 F-4F-4s were destroyed, and 17 F-4F-4s damaged. The 67th seemed to be the main target, every salvo but 1 landing near its camp at the north end of the fighter strip. 16 planes had been in commission the evening before. Only 1 now remained, the Resurrection, the oldest, most beat-up clunker on the field. Affording some consolation, nothing but an enormous oil slick, suggested the Hiei on the 14th. Whether at this point the Japanese supposed Henderson Field had been knocked out, as it had virtually been knocked out by similar shelling in October, or thought that the American Navy was too weak to interfere, or accepted a combination of these hypotheses, is unknown. At any rate, Japanese transports which had been hovering in the Upper Solomons finally reversed course and came on for Guadalcanal. On the 14th Commander, South Pacific Area directed the Enterprise to attack these transports, and as additional striking power, the B-26s of the 70th Squadron were sent up to Guadalcanal, under Major Leroy L. Stefanowicz. 10 Marauders, in company with 4 P-38s, left Plains de Gaillac at 8 a.m. At Espiritu Santo, the bombers were refueled and took off, disappearing in the clouds before the P-38s could be readied for flight. Meanwhile, during the morning, the planes of the Enterprise and Marine flyers from Henderson struck at the warships, now retiring to the north, whose shells had wrought such havoc with the 67th the previous night. At 8:30 a.m., General Harmon had reported that his search B-17s had sighted the Japanese convoy, cargo ships and transports, 12 of them 20 miles north of New Georgia. The escort consisted of a near dozen warships never positively identified. In addition, there was an advance group of vessels, including at least 1 battleship. Among the B-17s making contact was Typhoon Magoon. Typhoon Magoon came back to Espiritu with tail surfaces entirely shot away. It had fought off 3 ME-109s, 3 Zeeks and a roof, shooting down 3 of these and perhaps 2 more. 1st Marine Air Wing at Guadalcanal heard Typhoon Magoon's report, and the dive and torpedo planes were readied. The convoy, carrying a force which General Vandergrift put at 30,000 to 35,000 troops, had been sighted and hit during the morning by SBDs from the Enterprise. At 10:18, 16 B-17s were ordered to attack from Espiritu. While the forts were making their way northward, Marine and Navy planes from Henderson carried out 2 damaging strikes on the Japanese armada. The B-17s arrived in 2 flights, the first securing 1 hit on a transport from 17,000, the second straddling a seaplane tender from 20,000. Of 15 land-based Zeros intercepting, at least 5 were shot down. The bombers suffered only minor damage. Throughout the day, the destruction of the transports, now separated from their escort, continued. The 67th, able to put only 4 planes in the air, helped provide high cover for the TBFs and SBDs. By nightfall, 8 of the 12 vessels were either sunk or gutted. In the early morning hours of Sunday, 15th November, the United States Navy Task Force, commanded by Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, sailed past Savo with the South Dakota and the Washington and slugged the Japanese hard. The enemy had come down with a force, including 2 battleships and a half-dozen cruisers. He left for safer waters minus the Kirishima, the Hiei's sister ship. 2 cruisers, 1 heavy and 1 light, may also have been sunk. With daylight of the 15th, one of the 67th's P-39s was out looking for breakfast fires, new tracks through the jungle, any sign of enemy activity. It was no routine patrol. Along the shore at Tassafaronga, about 18 miles west of Lunga Point, the pilot saw a beached vessel. 2 more were in process of beaching, and another was heading for shore. Here were the survivors of the 12-ship convoy which had been worked over the afternoon before. To make sure, the pilot flew over at 800 feet with the anti-aircraft artillery literally bursting under his nose, then back to Henderson with his discovery. Abetted by the Navy and Marine flyers, the 67th Fighter and 70th Bombardment Squadrons played havoc with the beached vessels. By 7 a.m., the 67th had in commission 5 planes which went out with the SBDs and the B-26s. All 5 dived on the last ship to reach the beach, scoring 2 direct hits, setting the vessel afire. The B-26s dropped a 1,000-pounder on the 3rd ship from 8,000 feet. 2 more 1,000-pounders burst among small craft attempting to unload supplies. At 9 a.m., the 67th returned with 7 aircraft to put 4 bombs on the only vessel not then burning. When the Japanese vessels were reported off Tassafaronga, 14 B-17s left Espiritu to attack. The first flight, arriving over the beach to find the destroyer Meade-shelling ships, which were already on fire, did not bomb. The second flight continued on up to the Russell Islands, made 2 hits on a burning transport, one of 4 derelicts abandoned by the Japanese in that area. The Marines, meanwhile, had been able to bring a 155mm battery to bear on one of the ships, in addition to the 600 rounds the Meade had expended. Marine or Navy aircraft attacked all day, and at 10:45 a.m., 4 P-39s made a hit on the least damaged of the blazing hulks. On their return, the flight spotted the bow of a sinking warship. Heads bobbed in the water nearby, whether friendly or enemy the pilots did not know. Returning to the Meade, the flight strung out in a line flew across the destroyer's bow, waggling wings, out to the survivors and back. 3 of these circuits convinced the destroyer and she went to investigate. The bobbing heads were American. The ruined vessels off Tassafaronga burned for 4 days, their twisted hulks symbolic of the blasted Japanese hopes. A phase of the Solomons campaign was at an end. Guadalcanal and Tulagi were now secure, and the American forces could give some thought to an offensive. The decision in November, unlike that of the previous month, had been obtained in 2 short but intense naval actions. The 67th, chief victim of the only Japanese shelling during the critical period, had been unable to strike heavy blows. Nor, in the nature of the case, could the B-17s based 640 miles away at Espiritu. Admirals Scott and Callahan, dead in action, and Admiral Lee deservedly garnered the greater part of the glory. After their decisive beating in mid-November, the Japanese made no major effort to recover Guadalcanal. During December and January, the Express continued to run, putting small forces ashore and a rather large one on 14th January. These increments, however, were in the nature of replacements. Henceforth, the enemy was forced to content himself with a tenacious defence. Never again did he mount a sustained threat to Henderson Field. For the Americans, the defensive period on Guadalcanal was over by December. The 1st Marine Division had borne the brunt of the Japanese attacks on Henderson Field. With the exception of the 8th and 2nd Marine Regiments, It was withdrawn on 9th December to be replaced during December and early January by 2 Army divisions. These were the Americal, which began arriving in November, and the 25th. These units, plus the fresh 6th Marine Regiment and the 2nd Battalion of the 10th Marines, now proceeded to the offensive on Guadalcanal. On 9th December, Major General Alexander M. Patch, United States Army, succeeded General Vandergrift, United States Marine Corps, as island commander. With more abundant fuel and supplies, air operations proceeded on a more extensive scale. The pattern remained the same. The Marines still directed air activity, but the United States Army Air Forces was more heavily represented. The Army Air Forces now was able to send up additional fighter units. Its heavy bombers moved forward to base on Guadalcanal, and all forces struck regularly at the Express on its trips down the slot. Marine was in easy range of the B-17s, and the new Japanese base at Munda Point received constant attention. On 17th of December, a preliminary offensive to the west was initiated, when the 25th Division, under Major General J. Lawton Collins, was brought into position. A determined drive up Guadalcanal's north coast was undertaken. The 14th Corps' push, opened on 10 January, proceeded amid bitter fighting, and finally freed Henderson from the menace of Pistol Pete. On 9th February, organized Japanese resistance was eliminated. On the 8th, a search plane sighted 15 enemy destroyers heading up the channel, the last run of the famous Express. It had apparently evacuated the remaining officers and active troops, and left hundreds of sick, wounded, and starving Japanese to be swept up by the Army. Army Air Forces units on Guadalcanal worked with the ground forces in much the same manner as had the old 67th Fighter Squadron. Better planes were available. P-38s for escort, P-40s for the middle air, and P-39s for escort and ground strafing. If a particularly stubborn enemy strongpoint were encountered, the B-17s might be called on to clear the way. The 67th had retired from Guadalcanal for a well-deserved rest, but pilots of the 44th, 68th, 70th, and 339th Fighter Squadrons took up the burden. Most significant among these encouraging events was the activation of the 13th Air Force, occurring, appropriately enough, on 13th January 1943. Although operational control remained with Commander, South Pacific Area, Army Air Forces units henceforth were trained and administered by a theater Air Force under General Twining. It was this Air Force, evolved from such pioneer units as the 11th Group and the 67th Fighter Squadron, that was destined to move up through the Solomons until it rested on the admiralties beyond Rabaul, then to swing along the north coast of New Guinea, through successive forward strides, anticipating the day when its mission reports would come in headed Tokyo.